Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gun Kim, Special Representative for Korean Peninsula Peace and Security Affairs. It is my honor to moderate this session today on this beautiful island of Jeju. Reunification may sound like a distant future, but I'd like to quote former Minister of Interior of West Germany and key figure of German reunification, Wolfgang Schäuble, whom I had a chance to meet last month in Berlin. Our job is not to predict everything, but to address what we can do today. He emphasized the need to continue preparation for reunification now. Sharing the unification vision with the international community is what Korean diplomats can and must do now. Reflecting on the wisdom imparted by Dr. Schäuble, I believe today's session is timely and relevant. Before we get started, let me briefly share with you one of the most meaningful but often overlooked achievements of the recent summit diplomacy of Korea. Unarguably, the recent ROK-US summit and the leaders' joint statement was a resounding success. And we have all seen how the media has been raving about the Washington Declaration, nuclear consultative group, and all that. But in my opinion, there is one sentence in the joint statement that hasn't been given enough attention that it deserves, which reads, the two presidents are committed to build a better future for all Korean people and support a unified Korean peninsula that is free and at peace. For your reference, it was the first time in 10 years such vision of reunification was included in the ROK-US summit document. In that regard, one commentator wrote in his recent op-ed that the 26th sentence will provide guidance to the alliance, offer hope to the Korean people, provide the solution to the nuclear and military threats, and set the stage for a united Republic of Korea to achieve new heights in the world. No wonder leaders of Germany and the European Union also explicitly joined in support for the vision for a free, peaceful, and unified Korean peninsula in their recent visit to Korea in the last couple of weeks. Of course, some might say it is pointless to talk about the reunification for the time being, considering the ever-heightening tensions surrounding the Korean peninsula. Or one might say reunification is just too costly. One might even argue what's wrong with the status quo. However, not to mention our constitutional duty to pursue peaceful reunification, it does serve the interest of not only the Korean people, but also Northeast Asia and the world as a whole. A unified Korea is a herald of peace. Reunification means sustainable peace instead of a geopolitical curse. A unified Korea is a booster of growth. South Korea's technology and North Korea's human and natural resources together will create a great recipe for prosperity. A unified Korea is a defender of freedom, democracy, and human rights. A reunified Korea will be a model for spreading universal values throughout the world. So under the banner of unification vision diplomacy, my ministry is doing its best to share with the international community now, not later, our vision for reunification in the long run. And today's session is part of that endeavor. So with that in mind, I have a few housekeeping notes. We have knowledgeable speakers from the US, China, and Korea. In that order, each speaker will have 15 minutes for presentation, followed by Q&A and discussion. We will end at 16:40 sharp, so please be mindful not to exceed the allotted time. If you have any questions, please write it down using the pen and paper placed in front of you and pass them to our staff. I read and ask the question on your behalf for effective discussions. Now, let's please welcome our first speaker. Dr. Bennett is no stranger to most of us. He is an adjunct international and defense researcher at RAND Corporation. His area of expertise is Northeast Asian security, especially the Korean Peninsula security issues. And he has traveled to the region about 125 times, but the first time to Jeju. His recent research addresses issues such as North Korean military threats, Korean unification, and future ROK military force requirements. Dr. Bennett, the floor is yours.
I thought it might be easiest to speak from up here since I will be going through some slides. So let me proceed along quickly to stay within our time limit. I'm going to talk about sustainable peace and reunification of the Korean Peninsula. But peace is not major war. We could become unified through a major war, but that's not really what we're talking about today. It could occur through some kind of collapse of the North Korean regime. That's not what we're talking about. What we are talking about is some kind of peaceful unification, which implies that there is some kind of agreement that leads to that. So ignoring the two that we're not going to deal with, we will focus on the one on the right. But let me note that there are substantial differences between these. If we ever have to deal with the first two, this current size of the Korean army is too small. It's just too small to do either of those first two. And so really we ought to be focused here out of pragmatic considerations of what's possible. With that in mind, okay, so how do we get an agreement on unification? Well, we're not going to be expecting that South Korea is going to surrender to North Korea. That's not the kind of unification we're talking about. We're talking about some kind of negotiation that leads to a South Korea-led unification. But to get that, presumably somebody's got to negotiate with the North Korean elites. It's got to take into consideration that Kim Jong-un is probably no longer present, because if he is, he's likely fighting against such an outcome. And the North Korean elites are also not going to be surrendering. They're going to be concerned about their futures and trying to make a good world for them. Now, why is that important? If you were a North Korean elite today, would you say, oh golly, I can hardly wait till we unify with South Korea under their control? I doubt it, because they've got to figure that that's really bad news. And unless the nature of their expectations are changed, it will be hard to get to a negotiated unification. But it's not just before, it's also after. If peaceful unification means that you want peace, that means a minimal insurgency afterwards. We have lots of experiences in the recent past where events have been followed by an insurgency that has destroyed the peace and destroyed, in some ways, even the unifications of countries. So we don't want that. We have to be very careful about the technocrats. One of the big mistakes that was made in Iraq was that the Ba'ath Party members were all kicked out of the government, their money taken away from them, and so forth. Problem was the people who manage water, electricity, all of those sorts of things, if they get kicked out, which is what happened there, those things won't work. And that was a disaster for a period of time. We also have to worry about what the Chinese response will be. And that's another issue which has got to be prepared so that everybody's in sync on moving ahead and we maintain peace. Okay, so let me give you a couple of examples of what I think that means for the North Koreans and the elites especially. Undoubtedly, we would demobilize the North Korean military. And when I say we, I really mean South Korea would demobilize the North Korean military. Now, some of them would probably be retained for integration purposes. In the East Germany, West Germany case, it was about 20% of the East German professionals, not the conscripts, almost all of those were gone very quickly, but of the professionals. But that means you've still got a whole lot of other military personnel in North Korea. For them, I worry that you could have a real problem with trying to do civilian reintegration when they are neither trained nor prepared to take on civilian jobs, and we wouldn't necessarily have those jobs for them. So who's preparing those today? Who's trying to get ready for that to happen? That becomes important. I think what that leads to is there's got to be a plan for some kind of public service that would occur with the military until personnel are retrained and ready to do meaningful things. I'll give you a simple example. You go up into North Korea and there's what, 800 kilometers of paved roads? 800 kilometers is about it. That won't work in an integrated society. We've got to have the roads paved. So why not take parts of the military, organize them into a public service group to start paving roads, train them how to do that, provide them the equipment, and then make them a company. And they can do that for a very long time to get all the roads paved. That's the kind of activity that may need to be prepared. What about reconciliation with regard to justice? We're going to throw all the elites into prison because undoubtedly they've taken bribes, they've done other things that in many cases are pretty bad. Well, you've got a constraint in Korea. South Korea has 50,000 prison spaces. There's a whole lot more than that in elites in North Korea. And oh, by the way, those 50,000 spaces are pretty well filled today. You're going to put people in the North Korean gulags? I don't think that would be a particularly good idea. So I think what we have to be thinking about here is some form of selective amnesty. Sure, there are people who really need to be taken to justice for what they have done, heavily on the human rights kinds of issues. But a lot of people who took bribes, well, they had to take a bribe because the government salary wasn't enough to feed a family, and so what choice did they have? There've got to be a lot of decisions like that made, but if you make it afterwards rather than before and start setting the conditions, what North Korean government person is going to think that they've got a chance with unification? We've got to be prepared. Same kind of things with property rights. There are lots of people who are anticipating that if there's a unification of Korea, they're going to go up and take over property that their families, their ancestors controlled in North Korea before the Korean War. And if that happens, they will fight with the people up in North Korea, and it isn't going to be very peaceful. So, you could give the property to the landlords, but they were landlords under Japanese law, if we remember correctly, so we could move away from that. We could leave the ownership unresolved. That was true for a large percentage of the German property for many, many years. Or alternatively, we could decide, well, let's give the property to the residents, but we don't want those residents fleeing to South Korea to get better jobs and such. They can have the property that they're living on, the home they're living in, if they stay there for 10 years. Otherwise, they give it up. So we need to have things like that that would provide incentives for the stability we would want. Now, I give those as examples. I've spent a lot of time talking with North Korean former elites who have escaped from North Korea. I prefer to call them escapees to defectors. These are the things they've told me they would want. They wanted as a North Korean elite when they were considering leaving North Korea and coming to the South. Individual safety and security. They would want some kind of position, wealth, They maintained their wealth. In Iraq, we took all of the money away, or a lot of it away, from the Ba'ath Party members. Family safety and position, and a role of importance. Now, those are all big things. Hard to get everybody in South Korea to agree to that. So I'm not trying to be naive. These are not easy problems. But if we don't resolve them in the short term, we either have a unification in the short term, which we're not expecting, that could have real troubles and maybe not work out, or we don't get a unification at all. These are some of the kinds of things we've got to address. And if you're interested, I've actually written about that. Free downloads at the RAND website. Okay, Benjamin Franklin said, if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. We don't want to fail to plan here. We've got to have this planned and implemented with laws and other arrangements made. So, what do I want to conclude here? Is peaceful unification of Korea possible? Yes, but tough. Are there preparations required? Absolutely. And if you don't make the preparations, the chances of a truly peaceful unification go very close to zero. What are the key preparations that are needed? Well, we need policies to convince the North Korean elites. Why would they ever agree to this unification? And they're the people who are going to have to, in some form of agreement, if it's not favorable to them. South Korea's got to be prepared to make these agreements and to resource them, and we've got to communicate with North Korea what we're talking about. And I'll leave it at that. Just note that I have another book as well that if you're interested in, again, on the RAND website. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bennett. I couldn't agree more with you on the importance of preparing for unification in detail and in advance, and the need for cooperation between Korea and the US regarding this issue. Now let's move on to Professor Chung Xiaohe from Renmin University of China. His main research focuses on China's foreign relations, especially with the US and the Korean Peninsula. He provides useful insights into China's perspectives on various issues through public presentations and media contributions. Professor Chung, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Special Representative. And also, I'd like to thank Ministry of Foreign Affairs for inviting me. So, you see, so when we're talking about peace and stability on Korea Peninsula, particularly unifications of the Koreans, I don't feel very confident because we are in a very difficult, precarious, volatile situations. And the unification may become remote rather than closer. And China, Koreans probably are the two major nations suffered national divisions. And we share the pains of such a kind of national split in the past 70 years. Because we all know the national divisions will invite a number of problems and sufferings. Number one, the national divisions will deepen the hatred, mutual hatred, the grievance, angry with each other among two sides peoples. And also such a kind of divisions has poisoned the two sides' relations and force each other to squander the precious resources to, number one, to recognize, secure diplomatic recognitions. Number two, court other people to their side. Number three, to promote propaganda campaigns. You attempt to represent yourself as a legitimate representative of the entire nations. So Chinese people and the Korean peoples are supposed to support each other in the unifications campaigns. But I don't want to deny some of the people, some of the Chinese people, some of the Korean people, they don't really want to see the unifications happen. I think that's politically unwise and morally wrong. So that's the sense I would like to address. China and the Koreans are the two nations suffered the national divisions, and two countries struggle to seek national unifications. You see what happened across Taiwan Strait relations. You see what happened on the inter-Korean relations. And both sides, as a matter of fact, have done a lot of unwise things. Number two, you see the Korean unifications face many traditional hurdles, such as the competitions of ideologies, competitions of diplomacies, and the competitions of political systems. All the traditional things prevent two Koreans from achieving national unifications. But what happened in the past few years further complicated the Koreans' unifications efforts. Number one, China and the United States strategic competitions. And these competitions, as a matter of fact, overshadowed the inter-Korean competitions. Many peoples, including me, more likely to perceive the inter-Korean competitions from the prism of China and the United States strategic competitions. So the importance, the prominence of the inter-Korean issues has been, to some extent, decreased. So that's the one sense. And as we know, China and the South Koreans have divergent policies toward North Korea. China wants to build a strong relationship with North Korea, and more Chinese people are likely to perceive North Korea as a strategic asset. Given what happened between China and the United States, and China is more likely to strengthen its relationship with the United States, with North Korea, because the two countries share the hostilities toward the United States. But now, the South Koreans' relations with North Korea are in the troubled waters. Both sides, after experience short-lived rapprochement, and seemingly the two Koreans is entering or has entered a new cycle of confrontations and competitions. And China and the South Koreans, such a kind of divergent policies could be vividly revealed by their attitude toward North Korea's ICBM launches. China was reluctant to support United States' proposed resolutions to sanctions the DPRK North Korea. But South Koreans, push hard to sanctions to denounce the North Koreans. So the two countries have divergent policy toward North Korea. And seemingly such a kind of divergence could not be narrowed in the foreseeable future. That's the old one. But new ones, China, South Korea, now have a divergent policies toward the United States. South Korea is the United States' traditional ally. After Yoon came to power, and he worked hard to promote South Koreans and the United States relations. And Yoon's recent visit to Washington, D.C., and the joint statement, Special Representative just mentioned, represented a closer relationship between United States and the South Koreans. But the United States now is China's major competitor. And the two countries engage in a head-on competitions on almost all the front. So, China and the South Koreans, they have quite divergent policies toward United States. So the two sets of divergent policies toward North Korea and United States make China and the South Koreans' relations much complicated. So that's bad news. And the second bad news for Korean unification is the Ukraine war. And these wars help to drive a wedge between South Korea and Russia. Because South Korea joined the other Western countries impose sanctions against Russia. And unfortunately, this war brings Russia and North Korea closer. And such a kind of change of relationship between Russia on one side and the two Korea on the other side, as a matter of fact, has complicated Korean unifications. And I believe as North Korea and the Russians' relations continues to grow in the future, and I think North Korea will seize the chance to break diplomatic isolations, economic sanctions, and military embargo. No doubt about it. So that's the bad news for Korean unifications. And the third bad news is North Korea's announced determinations to hold its nuclear weapons. And today, as you see, North Korea has launched the satellite, reconnaissance satellite, and failed. And the North Korea's determination to possess nuclear weapons and its announced intention to use technical nuclear weapons against the South Koreans, even under conventional military attack from South Korea and or United States, force South Korea to seek nuclear weapons. And I like to say, in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to see how South Koreans to acquire its nuclear deterrence. That would constitute one of the major events that will unfold in Northeast Asia. So basically, three bad news in the past, make Korean national unifications much complicated or difficulties. But certainly, there are two good news I'd like to emphasize. And the two good news, to some extent, are associated with the bad news. The first news, the Ukraine wars certainly help to put Kim Jong-un and Putin in the same boat. Because you see, after the Russians invaded Ukraine, the North Korea basically took side with Russians and support Russians diplomatically. And North Korea is only one of the few nations who support Russians. But if Kim and Putin in the same boat, if Putin's boat is running in troubled water, experts believe the war is going on not in favor of Putin. If Putin's boat is running into troubled water, so does Kim Jong-un's boat. So the two guys, their fates of the two leaders, to some extent, are closely linked. The second good news, the North Korea's refusal to give up its nuclear weapons means the UN-imposed sanctions and other unilateral sanctions from individual countries will remain in place. The effectiveness of the economic sanctions and the military embargo against the DPRK remain controversial. But for my observations, the sanctions will continue to weaken North Korea's desire to make its economy strong and military strong. And even though, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, individual countries may break the economic sanctions against the DPRK in the future, but such a kind of actions would not be as systematic. And such a kind of efforts to break UN-imposed sanctions would be risky and costly and will not systematically change the awkward economic and military situations in the North Koreas. So North Korea's determination to maintain nuclear weapons, as a matter of fact, runs against itself. And I don't see there's any chance North Korea will give up its nuclear weapons in the future. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chung. Yes, you gave us a clear outline of the challenges and opportunities that we are facing. Thank you very much. Finally, I would like to introduce Professor Park In-hui from Ewha Women's University in Korea. He is the president of the largest academic society in the field of international relations and security studies in Korea. His research area mainly covers Korean Peninsula issues, international security, and ROK-US relations. He has been advising the government of North Korean on North Korean issues for a long time as a member of several committees. Professor Park, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vice Minister Kim. Thank you for such a kind introduction. This is my honor to be invited to a very meaningfully designed session based on the issue regarding the Korean unification. I'm going to mention in particular two issues. The first one is about the connectiveness between Korean Peninsula and East Asian or Northeast Asian regional security condition. If you think about the background of the the current Korean, two Korea's condition, we definitely carefully and deeply think about international factors regarding the Korean Peninsula security condition. Second issue that I would like to mention is nuclear issue. Well, it is a very debatable one. I really don't know what is the original North Korean leaders' intention when they first designed the nuclear program about 30 years ago. But whatever their real intention and original intention was, nuclear issue one of the very critical barrier to think about the future unification between the two Koreas. So my second issue about North Korean nuclear issue. In terms of the interconnectiveness between Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asian security concern, after end of the World War II, someone may disagree, but after World War II, scholars in international relations normally identify 5 countries who are divided, even though as one nation, mostly because of the international factor. Normally we identify German case and Vietnam, and Yemen and Korea, slightly different, but China as well. But we definitely respect the one China policy currently. In terms of the unification process, we normally mention 2 cases: German way of unification and Vietnam way of unification. Whenever people in Korea, whether they are from academia or policy group, we mostly mention about the German peaceful way of unification. Countries such as Germany, Vietnam, Yemen, they all achieved unification, and no one say China is divided by 2 countries. So in that circumstance, Korea is the only cases who are still divided after World War II, and usually when we say in the post-war period. The Northeast Asian circumstance or East Asian regional security circumstance is very critical factor whenever we think about unification. In particular, if you think about Northeast Asian, 3 countries interdependent relations among Korea, China, Japan. In terms of the economic relations, you know that 3 countries' GDP is almost higher than 25% of the whole global GDP. And you can easily imagine how deeply Korea and China interdependent in terms of the economic relation, trade issue, and Korea-Japan relations and Japan-China relations as well. In terms of the social, activities and in many criteria, those 3 countries in Northeast Asia are very interconnected and interdependent. But if we move the other areas, such as political issue or security issue, we are very sensitive. So according to the terminology from the international relations theory, unfortunately, there is no spillover effect in Northeast Asia. I mean, the very close and interdependent friendship in so-called low politics, but outcomes or consequences of the achievement in low politics never moves to high politics, in particular among 3 countries. And in particular, whenever we think about unification issue or inter-Korean relations, the sensitiveness between Korea and China, and between US and China, and between Japan and China is more serious. The discussion is getting more serious, as you all understand. So, as partly mentioned by the previous speaker, as long as China understands North Korea is a critical buffer zone between US and China competition, it is very hard to achieve unification. And also, as long as the reflection of the US-China competition clearly goes to the Korean Peninsula, it is very hard to achieve the unification. So, it is kind of the main job of the Ambassador Kim, how to make a reliable rationale or logic to persuade them, unification of the Korean Peninsula definitely beneficial, friendly, and circumstance to not only Northeast Asia, but also the whole global perspective. We need a well-designed logic and rationale to our neighboring host countries. That is one of the most critical mission for the future unification. Second issue is about nuclear one. There are kind of if my vocabulary is political, please forgive me. There are 5 legally recognized nuclear states, such as US, China, Russia, and UK, and France. And 3 the nuclear owners as well, such as Israel, Pakistan, India, who never used to be member of the NPT regime. If we recognize North Korea, as you all understand, if we recognize North Korea as nuclear owner, it's going to be the first example, the first case who used to be member of the NPT and finally left the NPT regime and then finalized the success of their own nuclear program. That is the main concern, not only by the Korean government, but also the leading countries and superpowers' main concern as well. Again, as I briefly mentioned before, I really don't know what was their real intention, North Korean guys' real intention when they first designed their nuclear program about 30 years ago. Simply speaking, in the early stage of in the post-Cold War period, and at the same time, among the South Korean people, as I mentioned, we are very divided in terms of the ideological issues, in terms of the socio-economic issues. We are very divided. South Korean people quite divided. We were used to be divided in terms of how to solve the North Korea nuclear program as well. Someone who in the conservatives group, their intention is to become nuclear state. Okay, within this circumstance, as long as we identify their intention is to become nuclear state, whatever we do is going to be meaningless. Whether they want to stop nuclear weapons or not, it's completely up to them, theoretically speaking. According to liberal groups or progressives, the intention of North Korean nuclear development is something kind of the diplomatic means or diplomatic chip. Once we interpret the intention in terms of the diplomatic means, whether they stop nuclear program depends on us or on international society. But after 2017, their final declaration of finalizing their nuclear program, the majority of South Korean people, we understand, people in the academia, people in the policy groups, or the general public, we assume their real intention is to become nuclear state. So ironically enough, even though I never agree, but according to their logic, according to their declaration, their nuclear program is for their survival, okay, whether you agree or not. So giving up their nuclear program is giving up their survival, according to their logic. So as time goes on, the nuclear program is getting higher and higher barrier to eventually achieve the unification of the Korean Peninsula. We clearly saw what happened in Singapore and Vietnam. We understood, and American government clearly guaranteed that according to the four articles of the Singapore Summit, American government guaranteed that new relations and peace regime on the Korean Peninsula and new relation between U.S. and North Korea. But since their intention is to become eventually nuclear state, according to their understanding, even new relations or peace regime is not equivalent to give up their nuclear program. That proved in Hanoi summit eventually. So I simply mentioned the international security circumstance regarding Korean Peninsula is one of the major barrier, and also North Korean nuclear program is also very critical barrier as well. Regarding within the two subjects that I mentioned, I would like to add something about South Korean official kind of democratization was normally known as the year of 1987. Interestingly enough, after 1987, the relatively speaking conservative government and then relatively speaking progressive or liberal government, they're interchangeable in terms of the leadership and in terms of the government. But interestingly enough, both conservatives and liberal government for the last 30 years, they all suggested kind of the functional approach to North Korea to eventually achieve for the purpose of the eventual achievement of the denuclearization. The typical example was during the Kim Dae-jung administration sunshine policy. Very functional approach. We suggest sunshine, not wind, rain or the snow. It was sunshine to achieve denuclearization. But I'm not sure. I would say that it never bring the meaningful success. Okay, and also the conservative administration, such as Lee Myung-bak administration, suggested very functional approach as well. Denuclearization openness in 3,000. Okay, we suggested very meaningful economic, exchange program and assistance, but North Korea never accepted. But the irony is, when I explained the East Asian security circumstance, Korea, China, Japan's economic interdependence never moves to security or political friendship. According to my language, it is kind of absence of the spillover effect. Inter-Korean relation is the same situation. I mean, sunshine policy, 3,000 denuclearization program, many attractive and meaningful suggestions and policy options never eventually produced North Korean full degree denuclearization. So within that sense, spillover effect, unfortunately, spillover effect never is not working into the Korean situation as well that we have to solve in the future. So I don't have the answer at this moment, but without careful consideration, neighbor countries' Korean policy toward the Korean Peninsula, and also without South Korean government carefully designing the logic, what is the benefit to China, what is the benefit to Japan, what is the benefit to US regarding the future Korean unification. It is very hard to achieve unification and peace on the Korean Peninsula. And also, as time goes on, the barriers of the North Korean nuclear program is getting higher and higher. So what is equivalent subject? What is equivalent subject that we provide them? Okay, to achieve, their giving up nuclear program is getting harder and harder question. So I'm going to stop here, and if I have any further question, I will continue the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Park. You pointed out the current international situation and what it means for reunification, as well as the necessary efforts in the unification process, including denuclearization of North Korea. Which I'm also in charge of. So, yes, for all my life, I was answering questions. But today I'm really comfortable because I'm asking questions instead of answering it. So I have 3 questions to each of you. So I think the first question might be that, this question comes from, not from audience, but beforehand we collected them from some students. And the question was that I understand that North Korea is considered very important as a geopolitical buffer zone for China. And so still, is China willing to support reunification? And if so, what would China expect from it? That was the first question. So maybe starting from Professor Chung Xiaohe. Yes.
Okay, so good questions. And certainly North Korea's geopolitical value is on the rise from Chinese perspective. So as I mentioned a little bit early, because China and the United States, the 2 countries are engaged in strategic competitions. So both sides try hard to pull as many as countries to their side, and the United States so, and China also wanted to do so, and they're doing so. So North Korea is one of China's traditional ally. Technically, North Korea is China's ally, and 2 countries signed alliance treaties in 1961, and this treaty still remain effective. So that's the one thing. And certainly, China and the Koreans share the same pains from national divisions. So China certainly expect the two countries, China as well as two Koreans, to achieve national unifications. And by whatever means, preferably is by peaceful means. And if Koreans could achieve national unifications earlier, that would set a good example for China to follow up. But if China achieved national unifications earlier, and also China's national unifications could greatly promote Indo-Korean's unifications. So the two national unification, as a matter of fact, interact with each other, reinforce each other, and also set itself as examples for the other side, for the other to follow, to formulate, to learn the lessons and the experience. So China, I think, have no reason to stand on the way of Korean national unifications. And that's my answer.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Bennett?
I think it's important that we recognize that China has tremendous interest in North Korea, the buffer and so forth. But China is also concerned about what would happen with the unification. If 500,000 or 1 million North Koreans flee across the border into China or attempt to, that's not going to be a very happy situation for China. And so, however this unification goes, again, I come back to it, if it's going to be peaceful, the North Korean, especially elites, but people more generally, have to have an expectation that it will be favorable for them so that they're not fleeing to China, that they're not causing a short-term security problem to China, but also very much like the German unification case, the last thing China, I'm sure, wants is to have major US and South Korean military forces on its borders. And so something would need to be done to make an agreement with China beforehand on how to manage that border issue and that security issue. And those are just two key examples, I think, that would need to be worked in a multilateral perspective.
Thank you. Professor Park?
Yes. Yes, I definitely understand China has a keen interest, national interest regarding Korean issue. And also, I'm not sure the most of the China scholars believe that way, but substantial number of China's policymakers and scholars definitely believe the Korean Peninsula is kind of their part of the buffer zone. You know that China shared their borderline with 14 countries, and China share with their ocean sea border line with 6 countries. So that means 20 countries share either ocean or the land share the borderline to China. So not only Korean Peninsula, but also Southeast Asia, Russia. You know how hostile between China and India. So the neighboring countries' relation is one of the major industry in China's government. In particular, according to my simple assumption, I understand Chinese people understand they have a meaningful influence over Korean Peninsula more than 1,000 years, such as Yi Dynasty, and Joseon Dynasty, and Goryeo Dynasty, and etc. So part of the critical buffer zone according to their way of interpretation. And also South Korean centric, theoretically speaking, South Korea centric unification can be interpreted according to Chinese leaders. Is kind of the whole Korean peninsula under the American influence, even though that I don't agree. So going back to my original argument, unification or whatever happened on the Korean peninsula in the future, it is not breaking out critical underlining the role of the buffer, meaning of the buffer zone to Chinese national interest, and it is not under the complete American influence, etc. We have to develop such kind of logic to our close partners such as China and even including Japan as well. So yes, I agree in terms of the buffer zone. I also emphasize the importance of the making logic again. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Park. I have a next question. It's about Japan. So, how do you see Japan's role in pursuing peaceful reunification on the Korean Peninsula? So, starting from Dr. Bennett.
That's an interesting complication to think about. I don't think the Korean people want to see Japanese troops come into Korea. So I don't think there's any role of that sort. I think, though, that there is clearly an economic role. Unification of Korea will require incredible investments to build up North Korean economy. And I think that Japan has the wherewithal to provide at least some of that funding, some of that support. There's a lot of mineral wealth in North Korea that everybody in the world will be interested in, as just an example. So I think we would be looking for China or for Japan primarily to provide an economic support kind of activity.
Yes, thank you. Professor Park?
I strongly believe, I believe Japan is supporting unification between the two Koreas, and I believe Japan definitely support peace and stability and eventual unification on the Korean Peninsula. But it is not easy to clearly figure out, okay? It's not easy to clearly figure out what is the role of Japan in the future process of the Korean unification. And not only inside of the Japanese society, but also in many, neighboring countries in Northeast Asia. For instance, Korea, we have our own way of the debate between normal Japan and civilian Japan. By saying normal Japan and civilian Japan, simply speaking, whether still Japan is kind of the respect on the lessons of Yoshida Doctrine, for instance. So as long as we have such kind of debate, Japanese government definitely have some difficulty to figure out their unique and their role in terms of the peace and unification process of the Korean Peninsula, and also Korea-Japan cooperation and partnership. What is the most appropriate partnership for the peace and unification on the Korean Peninsula is also very not easy to achieve. But as you all understand, this is slightly different from the main question, but as you all understand, Korea-Japan relation is kind of the lot of the multi-track. Okay, Korea-Japan relation is lots of the multi-track. Okay, within those multi-tracks, we have a historical debate, we have economic cooperation, we need a security, cooperation as well, and also we sometimes seriously, hostile debate over the historical issue or comfort woman issue, but simultaneously for some circumstances, for some industry, we need cooperation. That is the nature of the U.S. Korea-Japan relations under the name of the multi-track. So, yes, theoretically they are supporting us, but again, figure out the specific solution and answer is very hard to show. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Professor Park. Professor Chung Xiaoho.
This is a very sensitive question since Japan had ruled the Korean Peninsula for more than half centuries. So it's very sensitive. Even as the professor mentioned, Japan will support South Koreans' efforts to make national unifications. But I don't think it's all the South Korean peoples welcome Japan to play such a more important roles in the national unifications. So that's the one thing. Number two is Japan is a Korean's neighbor. And these countries just cannot walk away and pretend what's going on Korean Peninsula has nothing to do with it. So Japan will definitely show its interest in Korean Peninsula's, definitely show interest in Koreans' national unifications. And we witness such interest become increasingly prominent and tangible as Japan, South Korea, and the United States agree to enhance the security cooperation to confront North Korea. And even the three nations plan to intercept the North Korea's planned launch the satellite, or satellite launch, sorry. In other words, the security cooperations between countries, between three nations, has reached to a point that they began to seek joint actions to intercept the upcoming North Korea's missiles. So in that sense, Japan's interest in Korean national unification is becoming tangible and concrete. So that's my observations.
Yes, thank you, Professor Chung. This might be the last question of our session. Yes, countries in the region must feel secure after the reunification. So, how should Northeast Asia build a multilateral security order after the reunification of the Korean Peninsula? That's a very complex question, but this will be our final question, and I'd like to ask Professor Park to start.
Yes, thank you for the question, Ambassador Kim. During my previous presentation, as I simply mentioned, in terms of the economic relations, trade relations, in terms of a lot of social exchange programs and human beings visit and Korea, China, Japan, we are too much interdependent. Okay. I'm not sure about the specific statistics, but almost about 30% of the South Korean GDP may be probably from the Korea-China trade relations. But in terms of the security discussion, in terms of the security cooperation, such kind of interdependence is hardly founded. Okay, it's hardly founded. Again, one of the main reasons is the absence of lack of the spillover effect between, casually speaking, high politics and low politics. Substantial number of the South Korean scholars pay a careful attention to that issue, to that question. Why there is no spillover effect in Northeast Asian region? if you think about the very meaningful process of the development of the European Union after World War II, the spillover effect was very carefully working from the beginning of the early stage. They are designed careful, economic cooperation and interdependence, and then the outcomes and consequences of the economic interdependence among European countries very naturally, efficiently, move to political and security cooperation. So some South Korean scholars say that we are different from Europeans, okay? And maybe spillover effect or functionalism, such kind of liberalist idea may only happen among Western countries, okay? Partly yes. Someone say that, if I answer to the question, some group of the South Korean scholars say that spillover effect definitely will happen. Okay, functionalism, mutual interdependence, not only economic area but also political area eventually happen. But we need time. Okay, some number of those Korean scholars, as you think about more than 300 history of the European countries, modern age of the international relation. Okay, it is less than definitely 100 years, and only 70 or 80 years many of the East Asian countries entered the modern age. So we need time and we need another years. Okay, and another group of the scholar, they say that because of North Korea, because of the, do not misunderstand, because of the China issue, because of Japan issue, security cooperation, it looks like very sensitive. But gradually, we are achieving spillover effect. We are achieving meaningful cooperation in security area as well. Okay, someone currently pointing out that way. Multilateral security discussion channel is critically important. Okay, I definitely believe U.S. may participate, whatever the outcome is. Multilateral discussion is very critically important, and also multilateral approach to solve the North Korean issue is very critical, important as well. So, according to my language, Korean people, maybe Europeans or even Southeast Asians, okay? I have a lot of the international students. I asked to foreign students from Germany or France, okay? You identify the French or German. At the same time, you have identity of the Europeans. They say yes. Korean people, including myself, I believe I all the time understand Korean. I'm not sure when I thought about my identity is Northeast Asian. Okay, so kind of the careful preparation. Okay, identity as being of the Northeast Asian is very important. So security in terms of the Northeast Asian community. Okay, the idea of the Northeast Asian community in terms of security collectiveness, such kind of ideation or policy preparation is necessary to eventually achieve multilateral talk in the region. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Professor Park. Professor Chung Xiaohe.
Yes, I'm quite pessimistic about the future of the establishment of multilateral security framework. Why? Because we don't have such a kind of foundations to establish a multilateral security framework, to establish new multilateral security framework. And China and the United States strategic rivalries are still regions. And North Korea and the Russians, the two countries, are sanctioned. And China and Japan's relations are in bad shape. So generally speaking, Northeast Asians, geopolitical situations, probably it's worst since China and the United States exchanged diplomatic recognitions in 1979. So under such a kind of bad, worse geopolitical situations, we can have the luxury to to pull the people, pull the country together to set up a multilateral security framework, deal with Korea issues, Taiwan issues, whatever issues. That's the one thing. Second, the current multilateral security mechanisms, such as United Nations Security Councils, literally defunction in dealing with North Korea's issues. So the existence of the mechanisms doesn't work because the lack of cooperations between major powers. So major powers cooperations is a prerequisite for any new multilateral security arrangement. Certainly, we just cannot sit there and do nothing. There's a number of things we can do. We can make good use of the individual security forums, such as Seoul Defense Forum, Shangri-La Dialogue, and the Xiangshan Forum. There's a number of the forums out there, so we can encourage all the relevant actors to participate, to exchange views and deeper understandings, and prepare to establish any new mechanisms. And also, don't forget about the dormant multilateral dialogue mechanisms such as six-party talk. Six-party talk was especially designated to deal with North Korea's nuclear issues. But these mechanisms now remain dormant, if not died. So when we're talking about establishing new mechanisms, and I think it's probably it's more pragmatic to focus on how making good use of the small forums, how to make wake up the dormant mechanisms. I'm stop here.
Thank you, Professor Chung Xiao. And please don't forget Jeju Forum. Jeju Forum is also important. So, yes, Dr. Bennett.
I think we have to recognize that there's not going to be a Northeast Asia NATO anytime soon. So stepping back from that and recognizing that there will be continuing competition, I think our objective should be balance. Initially, we should be looking for balance between the military powers in the country, in the region. I think we should follow the example of China and Russia of pulling back heavy forces from the borders and maintaining only light border control forces there. And then I think the third element is we need to be looking at arms control. There are a lot of arms in this region, the North Korean military forces being a perfect example of a size of military that is absolutely not required for anything other than offensive purposes and therefore could be reduced. So I think we should be looking in the period after unification for arms control. We're never going to go to zero. We've got to have something greater than that, but something that is not as threatening to each other, and especially on the nuclear side. For a long time, the SALT and START negotiations helped reduce tension between Russia and the United States. I think we will, in the not too distant future, want to have the same kind of negotiations between the United States and China, for example, to try and reduce the nature of the threats there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Now we have come to the end of today's meeting. I would like to thank our speakers as well as the great audience for their active participation and contribution during the session. In my view as a moderator, today's discussions on various issues related to reunification were timely and useful. Before closing, I would like to commend the Jeju Forum for their extraordinary support for the meeting and during the preparatory process, both substantively and logistically. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you very much.
그럼 이것으로 이번 세션을 마치겠습니다.